the title of your Economics 11 course is Markets and the State. Did you ever look at the syllabus and it says Economics 11, Markets and the State? Because it just goes to show you how the markets and the states interact in economics and therefore in economic development. And this chapter shows you the movement in the thinking. During Adam Smith's time, the state was considered to be the overall decider of what things are going on in the economy. And Adam Smith actually was a counter, a revolutionary in that sense. He says, no, it should be the markets, because he had the invisible hand. And so it's since that time there have been always controversies, not controversies, because except for the period when the Chinese communists and the Soviet Union were up there, there was really no contest. There was going to be some role for the state and some role for the market. What role that is, how it was going to be applied, and when it was going to apply is a subject of all the controversy that we're having now. For example, when I say that the Soviet Union and Red China were the exceptions, is because theirs was a totally centrally planned economy. There was no role for consumer and producer, private producers, none at all. And the problem why central planning was sought by a lot of countries was because at that time it was perceived that the Soviet Union was a success. They had moved from feudalism to industrialization, and they seemed to be doing very well. Certainly, they were one of the world powers, right? And so a lot of developing countries looked to them as inspiration. And of course, we know what happened in the 90s. The Iron Curtain went down, and China soon followed. And China now has market and the state. Vietnam has market and the state. Russia has market and the state. It's just how much state there is and how much market there is. And so right after the World War II, that's when the problem just came up. Why do you think the problem came up right after World War II? We're talking about the chapter now. Why did the problem of markets and the state come up? What do you think happened after World War II? A lot of states became independent. The Philippines became independent. So many other countries, India became independent. We were all before colonies. We were ruled by elsewhere. Now we were on our own, well, perceived on our own, and we had governments. And that was the question, what was the government going to do? The problem was, so that's why this question came about, how much government? And as I said, people were inspired by the Soviet Union. People were inspired, well, certainly Red China was inspired by the Soviet Union example, and all the other countries that were under their ambit were inspired by them. Also in India, the leaders were inspired by what was going on in Great Britain, because most of them studied in Great Britain, and they were influenced by the economists that were going on at that time, especially Fabian socialism. So, what are the issues with respect to market and the state? This is now Economics 11. What are the issues with respect to markets and the state? Why is the state necessary? Why is their government necessary? Somebody?
Ma'am.
Yes.
Ma'am, for helping regulation.
Yeah. Why do you have to regulate?
Ma'am, paminsan po kasi, paano ba? The market may have sometimes have problems. For example, when it comes to matching supply and demand, and sometimes the government is there to help facilitate.
What do you call that? What do you call that when markets have problems?
Market failure.
Market failure.
Market failures. And what are these market failures? Why are there market failures in the first place? In other words, okay, let's start even one step further. Why do markets exist? I mean, what are the assumptions which are under consideration or which are given when we say market is the best for deciding what to do, how to produce, what to produce, etc.
Ma'am, because the market gives the most efficient products to the consumers.
Most
So,
efficient. What market is most efficient? All markets?
ma'am, for example, when there's perfect competition.
Purely competitive situations. In other words, the assumption for that markets, I mean, the conclusion that markets give the most efficient allocation of resources, etc., is based on the fact that markets are purely competitive. And what is a purely competitive market, sweetheart? Hey. What's a purely competitive market, Johanna?
Ma'am, when there's like low barriers to entry and like the firms can compete.
Barriers to entry. Ano pa?
Help.
Jesus, you are budding economists.
Ma'am.
Basic economics. Kelly.
Many small and independent firms, ma'am.
Very small, di ba? Atomistic. It is an atomistic market. The buyers are very, very small, very, very many. The sellers are very, very small, very, very many. So that there's what is the important thing about that smallness and that magnitude of number?
Ma'am, the firms are price takers.
That's right. They are not price makers. They are price takers. No one has any influence over price. The moment anybody has influence over price, that the monopsony or monopoly starts to come in, right? I mean, these are the most basic things. Okay, so can you imagine that's what's going to happen? All right. So obviously, what else? There's got to be perfect information. There's got to be, the products are supposed to be homogeneous. In other words, you cannot differentiate between the product that you're buying in a market. In other words, one butyl of rice is exactly the same as another butyl of rice, or if you will, one tube of toothpaste is exactly the same as another tube of toothpaste. There is no way to differentiate. Obviously, these are very, very harsh assumptions. They cannot obviously be followed. So when they are not followed, for example, when there is monopoly, do you call that a market failure? Is that a market failure?
Yes.
Yes, it is, obviously. Monopolies, monopsonies, etc. Those are signs of market failures. Ano pa?
Hi, ma'am.
Yes, go
So
ahead.
the existence of externalities then po.
The existence of what do externalities do, sweetheart?
So there are two externalities, meron pong positive and negative. So yung negative externalities, they impose an additional cost to yung productivity po ng isang firm nag-impose ng additional cost to a third party.
Externalities are spillovers. Anong ibig sabihin ng spillover? Give me an example of externality. Negative or positive?
Pollution, ma'am.
Kelly?
Pollution, ma'am.
Okay, what does pollution do?
For example, ma'am, like the classic externality examples when a firm by a river pollutes the water. So the communities nearby, they suffer the effects of the pollution and they have to carry the cost
Why do they call it an externality?
because it's not internalized by the firm
That's
that
right.
causes the externality.
In other words, the cost of that pollution is not borne by the firm. All right. So right there and then, what happens? There is a difference between marginal private costs and benefits and marginal social costs and benefits. In pure competition, absent externalities, market failures, etc., marginal costs and benefits and social costs and benefits are the same. But the moment externalities comes in, marginal social costs are different from private social costs. Marginal social benefits are different from marginal social benefits. So in that sense, there is need for some intervention. Who will intervene? The government. So the role of the state comes in. For example, when there are monopolies, what is the problem with the monopoly? Anything or monopolistic competition. What is the problem?
High prices po, ma'am.
Higher prices are greater than the competitive prices, and outputs are smaller than competitive prices, right? So there is again a gap between marginal social benefits and marginal social costs, as marginal social costs and benefits and private social costs and benefits. What happens when there is a monopoly? When there's a monopoly, when output is less than what than would have been produced under pure competition.
There's a deadweight loss po.
Yeah. Okay. Will you expand on that?
Ma'am, because the prices are too high set by the monopoly that there are no people that are willing to purchase any more of
There
the
are people.
output.
No, there are people who cannot, who are not able to buy what they should be able to buy. In
Apo,
other
apo.
words, the marginal social benefits are the marginal social benefits are greater than the marginal social costs at that point. So it actually needs to increase the output, but the output cannot be increased because the private monopolist is producing where his marginal social, where his private social costs are equal to his private social benefits now, private
Apo,
marginal social costs.
apo.
You agree with that? So that's the case where government must come in under monopoly. Externalities, ano pa? Saan pa? Saan pa kailangan? Well, if there is a natural monopoly, in other words, can't help it, it's a natural monopoly. Is that a reason for government to come in? Class? Yes. What? To regulate it. That's where the regulation comes in, right? Or any other example of a market failure.
Public goods.
Public goods. What's the matter with public goods?
Since public goods can induce free riding, the free riding problem.
Tell me, what about the free riding problem?
Since public goods are
Free riding.
not excludable and non-rival, so like my consumption of the public good does not diminish the consumption of others, so others may not like pay for the good.
They are free riding. Ano pa? Any other problem with respect to public goods or public bads? The adverse selection problem.
Yeah.
I
Information
all of
asymmetry,
this
ma'am.
look up in microeconomics, in economics 11, etc. They are the basis. That's why economics 11 is called markets in the state, because you're looking at the, where the state comes in. What is the problem when the state comes in? What could be a problem? That was that was made very, very clear in that chapter. So you didn't read the chapter, you may not be able to get it. Ano ang problema pag may government? Is there a problem? Does government's entry into the equation resolve matters? Yes.
There's a possibility that government intervention would make it worse.
Yes.
There's a risk.
All right. The risk is, what is that called in your chapter?
Government failure, ma'am.
Government failure. Problema, papasok yung government, pala yung government failed. Are there examples in the Philippines of that? Oh God, any number of examples. Even up to now, the National Power Corporation, there's been, there's been talk about privatizing it because government failure. Why is there government? I mean, why does government failure loom so large in the Philippines? Ano ang nangyayari sa government corporations mo?
Ma'am, I think the government's institutions are not really that strong, and that they're also very susceptible to corruption, red tape, and all other issues.
See, when a corporation fails, when a corporation fails badly, anong ginagawa? The corporation changes its head, right? It fires them, etc., brings in another. Does that happen in a government corporation? Hindi. The government corporation can be losing money hand over fist. And if the government corporation head is political appointee, hanggang dyan na lang, hanggang dyan na lang ang corporation. No way of correcting the situation internally. And that's why the government got into a tremendous amount of debt during the debt crisis. All right, because on the other hand, the foreign bankers and IMF, etc., insisted that the government take over the debt. Is that clear? All right. Now, when we are talking about the end of the World War II, there were a lot of countries, industrialized countries, that had, that were devastated. Every country in Europe was devastated, including Germany, and Japan was devastated. The Philippines was devastated. The Philippines, I think, was what do you call it? The Philippines was the second most devastated country in Asia at that time. Why was the country most devastated? To anybody? Well, none of you were obviously alive at that point. Did you study Philippine history? Why was the Philippines destroyed completely? Well, at that time, the Philippines was destroyed completely because MacArthur insisted on returning to the Philippines instead of waiting for Japan to surrender. MacArthur insisted, honest to God, these are personal decisions, because when MacArthur left the Philippines, he said, "I shall return." And by God, the man was going to return no matter what. And that's what caused because the Japanese were fighting back, they were retreating, bombs were falling. The bombs that destroyed Manila were not Japanese bombs. They were American bombs. There were no fighter planes anymore the Japanese fighter planes. But the bombs that destroyed Manila were the American bombs. It was terrible, but we only knew about it much, much later, right? We were so, I mean, please don't get me wrong. I still think the United States is the best partner to have, but these things happen. And do you realize that at that time, the president of the United States rescinded the act to pay the guerrillas and the people who were in the American army, the Philippines with American army. The United States rescinded that. We were the only country in which they rescinded their decision. All throughout the war, they were saying the people who are fighting for the Philippines, these are facts that will make you not like the United States. But the United States is not an angel either. But between the United States and China, I'll take the United States anytime. I don't know why. It may be a racist thing in me. But well, no, it's actually not. It's a question of how much better you can perform. Anyway, that's what happened. All right, devastation. And the only industrial country who was not devastated was who? Was which country?
The US, ma'am.
Of course, the United States. They were the victors, diba? They were the ones that went to Europe and defeated Japan, went to Japan and threw bombs on Japan. They were the ones at the helm. And what did they do? What happened? What happened in the in the world? There was the international, there was a United Nations was formed, and at the same time, what was formed? The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. That's the name of the World Bank. International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And then the IMF was formed. This was under, these were all the recommendations of John Maynard Keynes. You realize that? He wanted an World Bank, he wanted the International Monetary Fund, the Central Bank of Banks, and he wanted a World International Trade Organization. But then World Bank and the IMF were accepted, but the International Trade Organization was not accepted. You must understand that at that time, the Great Depression was still in the minds of everybody. There was a common understanding, a common belief that we had to protect our own. So that's essentially why it was so difficult for the world to get back on its feet. International trade was not very popular at that time. People thought, and so when the new nations came about, they saw what was happening and they said, well, if the big countries do it, why don't we do it too? Why don't we protect our own? Because at that time, import substitution was the main attractive factor. All right? I mean, you must see this on. You cannot say, why naman those countries were import substituting? How silly naman they are. Well, because that was what was happening during that time. All right? So here it is, devastated countries. The United States gave aid. You must remember, people were talking about investment, savings, and capital, right? The early growth models, Harold Domar. They were talking about aid. They were talking about helping other countries get up on their feet. What was the difference between helping an industrial country like Japan and the and Germany with helping some country like the Philippines or Nigeria or Ghana? Do you think there was a difference?
Europe and Japan had better institutions than the Asian countries that were devastated, or
You know,
African countries.
class, nobody thought about that until the 1990s. When Friedrich North came out and said, you know, these are the institutions behind. So here there was the World Bank trying to do the same thing to industrialized countries and to developing countries, and they couldn't understand why the formula worked with industrialized countries and it did not work with developing countries. They could not understand why reconstruction was different from development, because the countries, the industrialized countries were being reconstructed, and they couldn't understand why the formula did not succeed for development. And it was, and as we have seen, as we know now, because of empirical work, that the greatest factor is and then in the 70s, what happened in the 70s? What was the thing? We're talking now about the 50s and 60s, all right? This was happening. Everybody was talking about import substitution, and that's the way to go. So international trade was not, when we talk about openness, that was not believed. All right. So what happened in the 1970s that changed the economic thinking?
Ma'am, there's a rise in oil prices.
Oh, ano pa? No. Yeah, and then what happened?
During that time, those oil exporters, they were able to invest in cooperation to international banks.
Mhm.
So it led to low interest rates on the loans across the world.
Yeah, but I'm talking about what changed economic thinking about import substitution. Do you hear a lot about import substitution now, class? That it was the Latin American countries, the Southern Cone, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, they were talking about import substitution. There was tremendous discussion with what is his name, Singer and Prebisch. They were the leading lights for import substitution, and they had empirical evidence to show it. What was the empirical evidence that was that supported import substitution? Anong sinabi ni Prebisch at saka ni Singer? Very simple, elasticities of demand. The elasticity of demand for agriculture is weak. I mean, not there. It's the elasticity of demand for agricultural goods, and all the developing countries, all they had to offer were agricultural goods, right? Was what we said was inelastic. So if you raise the price, not much. If you lower the price, not much more will be demanded, right? All right. So ayun ang nangyari. And the elasticity of demand for the industrial goods were very elastic. So price changes could affect what was going on. So even if you increased your productivity and thus decreased your price in the agricultural countries, their incomes would fall, right? Total revenue decreases when a price decrease occurs. In an in an economy with elasticity, very high elasticities of demand, when the price with price decreases, what happens? Incomes increase. So that's what Prebish was saying. You know, the facts are against us. So what then happened? What countries came about that questioned that particular principle or that particular theory? Ano nangyari? Sino mga lumabas in the 70s and the 80s? Oo.
The 4 East Asian tigers rose during the 70s.
Ayan. Singapore. Well, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea. All right, starting from the 70s, they were showing a different kind of development strategy. They were not talking about import substitution. They were talking about exports, right? That's what happened. And does that mean that the countries were not import substituting? There was, but they focused on trying to export, and they succeeded. Now, here is where, who is the one that's going to be talking about Studwell? Sino ba yan? Sinong grupo that's talking about Studwell? Which
Group 2, ma'am.
Yes, huh?
Group 2
Group
po.
2 po.
You will find out that Studwell did not think that Singapore and Hong Kong were the proper, were worth talking about, because they were just city-states. South Korea and Taiwan, ayan. At sinabi ni, and that's where Studwell had his different perspective, which I want you to be able to concentrate on and to talk about. All right? Because Studwell was talking about agrarian reform. He said the beginning of the development of South Korea and Taiwan was agrarian reform. And he said that that also was the case for China and Japan. This is an amazing thing. All right. So anyway, that is what happened. Something new came about, and then who was the one who was talking about the oil prices? Ano nangyari sa oil prices in the 70s? Oil price went up. Why did the oil prices go up? Why did oil prices go up?
OPEC nations were
development. Huh? Oil prices went up because
of the OPEC nations, ma'am. They were
absolutely. There was a cartel, and it was a self-declared cartel. They didn't give a damn about market at all. We'll get together, and we're together going to influence the price. Of course, not by saying this is the price it's going to be set, by doing increasing or decreasing the supply of oil. They weren't saying we're setting a price. No, they did it by reducing or increasing supplies. All right, they then distributed what the supply was going to be among all the countries. Generally, all the countries would take what they want, and it was Saudi Arabia who would take the difference. I mean, Saudi Arabia was they say we can only decrease our supply by this much, and the world supply had to be decreased by a certain amount. Saudi Arabia would step in for the breach. And this Saudi Arabia did for a long time, until there was a time when Saudi Arabia said, enough. And it just got sick and tired of being the parang timon. You know what timon is in timon? None of you have ever played blackjack before. Timon is the one who essentially shows. I mean, is the one that gets the responsibility for the whole group, something like that. Anyway, So when this happened, so there was increased prices naturally. They decreased their supply. No problem, no question about it. They decreased their supply. And did it succeed for them? Did it succeed for them? Yes, because the oil prices increased tremendously. And what happened because of the increase in oil? What happened in oil prices? They were just full of money. And that was the start of the debt problem, because the banks were full of money. This was the dollars, the OPEC dollars, and they got the deposits from the oil producing countries, and they had this money that they had to lend. And who were the prime borrowers?
Latin America countries.
Latin America, also the Philippines. The Philippines was the only country in Asia. Why? What happened in the 70s in the Philippines that allowed this to happen? What happened in the Philippines in the 70s? Of course. Marcos was there. He was the one. And the banks would approach Marcos, not the foreign banks would not approach anybody else. They would approach Marcos and give loans at very low interest rates. No problem. So Marcos was borrowing like there was no tomorrow. And there was no problem. How did this beautiful situation come to an abrupt end? So all the countries, well, the Asian countries were not borrowing. The Philippines was borrowing, Latin America was borrowing, Africa was borrowing. What broke this beautiful story, this beautiful picture?
Ma'am, when the US contracted their money supply, so the interest rates rose and the US dollar appreciated.
Why did the US do that? You think the US did it on its own? Ano ang nangyari sa United States? I mean, this is all an economic story, really.
Ma'am?
Yeah.
The United States experienced inflation during that time, so they had to contract the money supply to lower that.
Remember, the United States was the country. Inflation, naku, tight money supply. Ano nangyari? Bumaba ba ang inflation nila? Ba't bumaba? No question. Pero may externality yan para sa ating mga lahat. Ano nangyari sa atin? What happened? When money supply decreases, what happens?
Ma'am, when money supply decreases, the interest rates increase.
That's right. Interest rates increased. And the problem with all those loans to all those developing countries were that the interest rates were mobile. I mean, they could change. That's the contracts said that. It was not a fixed interest rate that they were charging, depending on the interest rates, not LIBOR, but some other interest rates. Then, so at that point, interest rates went up. So you had two things happening at the same time. You had the corrupt governments who were borrowing, and the projects were not productive. Because if the projects were productive, there will be no problem paying back the interest, right? If they were not, but most of them were of dubious provenance. And that is what happened to the Philippines. The country was borrowing, talagang over-borrowed for projects which should have cost only so much, but they were priced at so much higher. And so when this thing struck, I mean, it would have happened eventually, but when this thing struck, when the United States decided, well, we cannot see that these interest rates are going up. We have to do something about it. They did something about it. And so this is what happened. At the same time, because they did it, what happened to the American dollar?
Ma'am, it appreciated.
Oh, just it appreciated. So imagine our loans. We're the borrowing country. Interest rate went up. And then nag-appreciate pa yung dollar. So the peso amount of the loan increased tremendously. You know, we were hit by two major blows. Appreciation of the American dollar, world interest rates rising. So we got killed. Did Thailand get killed? No, wasn't borrowing. Korea didn't get killed, wasn't borrowing. The Philippines only got killed. That's what happened to us. And that's when we saw our first really major recession. For 2 years in a row, the GDP growth was negative at about 7.7%, I think it was. It was terrible. And our interest rates went up to 50%. I mean, inflation went up to 50%. You were not yet born. We were living it. It was a terrible time, but it was an exciting time because at the same time, that was when, Ninoy was killed. That's when we got all excited about getting back our country, and that is what happened. But the Philippines, I must tell you, was the only country in Asia that experienced the international debt crisis. I'll tell you one other thing. Remember the incremental capital output ratio, ICOR? You must remember that for the exam. The ICOR, our ICOR went from, I think, somewhere like 4 in 1970, in the early 70s, to 12 in the 1980s. Anong ibig sabihin nun? When your ICOR goes from 4 to 12, given our conventional analysis here, what does that mean?
Ma'am,
Yes,
capital just became more inefficient.
absolutely. It is, when the ICOR is 4, it takes an additional 4 pesos of capital to create 1 peso of output. In the early 1980s, it went up to 12 pesos of capital to produce 1 additional unit of output. Ano ang ibig sabihin nun? The conventional econ it is inefficient use of capital, corruption. That's what it was. So that's what happened in the 80s, and so what did that do for economic development? It was a lost decade of development. How did they measure that? Well, the per capita income in before the debt and when was a certain amount, and then the debt crisis occurred, and then when did the per capita income before the debt get attained again? With us, it was not a decade. With us, it was more like 16 years. I showed you, did I not? In my first,
Yes, ma'am.
my very first, I showed you that it took from 84, the 1984 value, 83 values of GDP were only attained again per capita GDP in something like 2002. It was a terrible loss. People don't realize it because their GDP is rising, no problem, but in terms of what we could buy, the per capita income did not get back to 1982 levels or 83 levels until, I think it's 82, until 2002. So it was 20 years for us. And that was a terrible 20 years because at that time, we had been under IMF supervision since 1963, I think. We were, I think it was only in 2002 that we went away from, we gained back. We did not anymore have to borrow from the IMF. So that was a very bad time for Philippine development. Very, very bad time. Okay. And this was experienced in some manner or another by African countries and definitely by Asian countries, and definitely by Latin American countries. And so what do you think happened? So this is what happened. The countries said, this is when the markets started getting mabango again, because the states were such, the governments were so corrupt and were so out of line. In other words, government failures that in terms of policy, in terms of everything. So the market situation got into the picture again. In other words, when government to market to governments to markets, this is how it goes. And so they had these structural adjustment programs and stabilization programs. What is a structural adjustment program and what is a stabilization program? Folks?
Ma'am, structural adjustment po, it's like trying to change the structure of the economy so it's more market-based, more open to international trade.
And what's a stabilization program? Ay, nako mga anak, dapat nag-aral na kayo because we're going to have the exam. Ano yung stabilization?
Oh, ma'am, for example, correcting price distortions. For example, they lower tariffs, but then it's obvious that it would hurt powerful people. So there were really a lot of resistance against these programs, the stabilization and structural adjustment.
Who was in charge of stabilization programs? What agency? I mean, you're talking about the United Nations and the multilaterals under the United Nations, like the World Bank and the IMF. This was an international debt crisis, right? The World Bank comes in. What was the World Bank? Ang World Bank ang structural adjustment, ang IMF ang stabilization. Kasi the IMF is the banker of, central bank of banks, they're lending. The World Bank is for development. And so they said for development, you have to change the structure. All right. And that was the market structure. And so how did the Washington Consensus come about? Ano yung sinasabi? What are the elements of a structural adjustment program, for example? But there are about 12 or something. Ang dami-dami. Just think of what the Philippines had to do.
Ma'am, for example, they would be having fiscal discipline, like they need to balance the budgets in order to prove that, for example, there would be policy failure if they had deficit of like 1 to 2% of the GDP.
So what are those things that a country was supposed to do? What was the main theme of structural adjustment? Please be more market-oriented. Stabilization program, please be more market-oriented. Ano yung hinihingi? Because these were conditions that were given for loans.
Liberalization, ma'am.
Ano yung ibig sabihin ng liberalization? Ang ganda-ganda yan.
So it was usually just making the market determine it instead of having the government be the one to set like your interest rates.
Yeah. What else? There are, I mean, it's even listed down in the chapter. Look at your books.
Ma'am?
You cannot look at it anymore during the exam.
Ma'am, there should be liberalization of foreign direct investment.
Please. In other words, we should get foreign direct investment. Okay, so what? Is that market? Here, fiscal discipline, reordering public expenditure priorities, liberalization of interest rates, competitive exchange rate, trade liberalization. Ano yung liberalization? Alisin yung mga constraints to all this. When there is trade liberalization, foreign direct investment liberalization, privatization, ano yun? Leave it to the markets. Leave it. Because governments have failed. And how did they know governments have failed? Ayan, so many countries collapsed. Yeah, right? Okay, the regulation, secure property rights, everything else. So this was, I mean, please remember, in Adam Smith's time, it was the state. And Adam Smith said, no, it's got to be markets. Then it was markets, and then it became the state, and then now it's becoming markets again. And I don't know how long how long this is going to last, but it keeps on going up and down. And up to now, different states have different combinations of market state. Depends on them. All right, now liberalization of foreign direct investment. Ano nakalagay? Let's talk about specifically. This is structural adjustment, huh? Okay. Go ahead. Liberalization of foreign direct investment. Restrictions on foreign direct investment should be removed so as to facilitate the inflow of needed capital, skills, and know-how. Is that an open sesame? I mean, there's a group that is supposed to be talking about foreign direct investments. Which group is that, Renz? Renz, just go.
Group 1 po.
Group 1.
Yes,
foreign
ma'am.
direct investments. You better make sure, huh? Because here in your book, they're not only talking about, this book always emphasizes, it's not just quantity, it's quality. All right. Now, what about the market transition? The movement of the Eastern European countries to markets because the Soviet Union collapsed, right? In other words, Soviet Union as a model, which China followed, was completely, negated. Na-realize nila ng Soviet Union that they were really behind. And so what happened? There was an emerging economy. There was a transition from centrally planned government state to markets. Ano nangyari dyan? Was it a successful transition for everybody from state to market? No. What were the problems? Again, there was a fight between those who wanted to do it all at the same time and those who wanted to do it gradually. Right? And this echoes the same kind of situation as what happened in 1960 when there was a difference of opinion between Rosenstein Rodan who talked about the big push, and Hirschman, who said, linkages, linkages, linkages. The same thing, except, in a different magnitude now, right? Well, not really different magnitude, but generally similar problem. Are we going to do it all at the same time, or are we going to do it gradually? Were there countries who did it all at the same time successful, or were there only the countries who do it gradually successful? Ano nangyari dyan? Well, China, in some areas, did it absolutely very fast. I mean, it's agriculture. It went from collective farming to farming, market-based farming right away. But where was it very slow? In its big industries, corporations. Why? Well, because the corporate managers were very strong in the party. They didn't want it done right away. And I think that they were correct, because these corporate managers didn't know how to do it, how to manage the market, so to speak, how to do it on a market basis. Poland did it all at the same time. And Poland for a while was thought to be a failure, but it turned out to be a success. You see, what happened in these things were economists, because boy, this was the age of economists. Jeffrey Sachs was an economist who thought that it had to be all at the same time. And he was very, very, very vocal about this. And there were economists who said, no, you cannot do it, you have to do it. In other words, class, this is all a situation of testing what is best for us. There is no one general rule for development. That's what Perkins and his colleagues are trying to say. There's no one rule. We may be for this, but there are arguments for the other side. Like population, there is one of their colleagues is totally against the reasoning that countries with very large populations fail to develop. And so the book tries to bring in at so many points what the arguments are that favor population increase, population decrease. All right. So you have the Soviet command, you have the transition. There's another thing that I wanted to emphasize. What is a hard government and what is a soft government? Please.
Ma'am, if it's hard government, they intervene actively in a way that promotes growth. Then if it's soft government, they can't do that.
They can't. Who can? Somebody tells them not to do it?
For self-government spot, they rely more on market forces rather than strictly doing their own policies.
What about a soft? What is a soft? Why do they call it a soft government? And is the Philippines a hard government or a soft government, and why? Okay. Was South Korea a hard government or a soft government? Was the Philippines a hard government or a soft government? Please make sure you understand why. Well, you can answer me because it's not in the book. Is the Philippines a soft government or a hard government? Why do you think it is? Gabrielle, and care to let me see who the others are. I haven't seen them yet. Joan, I've seen you. Jalyn.
No, ma'am.
Philippines a soft government or a hard government?
I think it's a soft government po.
Why?
Because yung, for example, yung exchange rates po natin isn't fixed, and capital flows freely into the country, and our central bank is independent of our government, and yung monetary policies as well are independent of the government.
In other words, they can intervene actively. They're strong, essentially. Why do you feel that the Philippines is not strong? Don't you have Duterte there intervening actively like mad? Oh. Why do you call the Philippines a soft government? Because it says soft governments are not unable to do so. Why are they unable to do so? They're not restricted by law. What is absent?
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I think it has to do with the motivation of the government. Like Duterte is very influential, but I don't think they're really motivated to do like promote growth and development in the country. They're just like serving themselves.
Does he know? In other words, you can be very strong, but if you don't know what you're doing, what's going to happen to you? Isn't it? You're very strong. Lockdown. Yung pala, it was not necessary to lock down. I mean, you have to target. That's one of the characteristics of hard government. They target. They don't divide by N. Like, I have to bring 3 barangay health workers to all the 45,000 barangays. That's so stupid, is it not? Because the municipalities, cities like Makati are so well able to afford that sort of thing. Who are the barangays that need 3 barangay health workers? Which are the barangays? They're the ones in the 6th class municipalities, 5th class municipalities, etc. Why does this government always try to do it divide by N? Why? Because the politicians there say, what about us? What's our share? So there is no thinking about the whole country. It's about their own individual constituencies. Yes? It's so terrible. That's what's happening to us. When you become, and I have no doubt at all that at some point in the future, some of you will be very high up in government circles. You must remember this. You have to think about the country, not about your own selves and about your individual futures. Because I bring money to my constituency, I will be voted for. That's the most ridiculous thing. That's what's happening to us now. Do you remember how much we have lost as a result of our lack of growth? How much in terms of income have we lost? I did not present that PowerPoint to you so that you can just ignore it. Some of my questions are going to be based on that PowerPoint presentation. How much? Because people say, oh, corruption, you cannot, it's very hard to quantify, etc. How much did the Philippines lose? And you say, well, if we grew as fast as Thailand did, we would now have a per capita income of so much. Is it not? That's how much the country has lost. That's the financial. And then how much the country has lost in terms of the other parts of development can be shown by the HDI. How are we with respect to Thailand? What is Thailand? And what is the Philippines? That difference must be part of what the reason why we are so bad. We are so worse off now. Why are we worse off than Thailand? My God, we were better than them. I remember because I used to travel to Thailand for UP, trying to get students for UP graduate school. I went once. And, you know, as far as I was concerned, Thailand was so much below us. And yet, our per capita income now is at least almost 1/3 the per capita income of Thailand, a little bit over that. How terrible. That's what we lost because of our inability to govern ourselves and our institutions properly. Well, anyway, okay, so tignan nyo ang summary, ha? The respective roles of states and markets in shaping economic development have been a central focus of debates. Even now in the United States, what has happened? Biden wins and it's more government. Government is more proactive. When Trump was winning, he said, no, don't let the markets decide. No, but the markets are so monopolistic and so oligopolistic in the United States. This is what has happened. The change, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, or initially, where the Democrats were for more government and the Republicans were for less government. So that is the experience of market pessimism. Did I forget anything? So remember what the Washington Consensus is, please. Moving away from the extreme. I did not get to ask. Was the Washington Consensus a failure or a success? Why or why not? This is for you to decide for yourselves. You know, you have to look. You think it's a good idea or was it not? Do you remember Joseph Stiglitz? You know, he's talking about what the World Bank and the IMF did and how it failed and why it failed. You should read those books. I mean, they're Stiglitz writes in a very, very articulate, very easy way to understand. But it will show you how economics is so crucial and the ability to formulate the proper economic policy is so crucial to a country. You should be proud that you are studying economics class. And don't, you know, just because you cannot answer the question now doesn't mean you will not be able to answer the question. Then when you are in high positions, I will tell you some of my failures. These were my students, the failures of the School of Economics. Sino ba yung taga Sorsogon? Anong pangalan niya? He's the governor of Sorsogon who ran for the vice presidency.
Escudero po, ma'am.
Escudero, he was my student. Sino ba? Naku, Diyos ko. What's his name? The one who used to be former Speaker of the House. Cayetano. And his sister, Cayetano, also. They were in the School of Economics, mga anak. Diyos ko. But I tell you, I think the current crop of students are more principled than those. Of course, you know what they say, when you are in a position of power, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I just hope that your level of of resistance to corruption becomes higher because we have undertaken this course. Okay, so next time, no, before class or after class yung